So welcome back to another Worst to Best, where I take an artist or a band and rate each of their albums from worst to best. Now, I know that most people on my channel were hoping for something a little bit more proggy, a little bit more avant-garde, but you know what? This is my channel, I do what I want. And in the winter time, especially near the January-February stretch, I find myself needing some joy. And this whole movement of spark joy thing for me is, I love ELO. I love Electric Light Orchestra so much. Their ability to blend a poppy approach with a kind of like a symphony, a full orchestra at times. I find myself near the beginning of February just diving into their entire discography and just devouring it. As with all of these, a little bit of a housekeeping at the beginning. I'm not saying that the #1 album is the definitive #1, and I'm not saying the first one I'm going to be talking about is the definitive worst. I'm just saying if I were to line up all the albums, which one would I choose to listen to first, and which one would I choose to listen to last? I'm not going to go too far in depth in reviewing any of these albums. It's just basically going to be a surface level kind of summary of the album, my thoughts, my feelings, and why I put them where they are. Within a lot of my past worst to bests, I've got a little bit of a feedback about why I've left certain albums off and certain albums not. And so this time I decided to include everything outside of compilation albums and live albums. So if they released a studio album, it's on here. And that doesn't include EPs, obviously. It's just full-length studio albums. So I won't have somebody being like, well, why didn't you include this on it? Well, tell you what, it's on here. There are 16 albums that I'm going to be talking about, so let's dive into number 16. Balance of Power, released in 1986. Yep, this one is definitely the worst. In this time frame for the band, they really didn't know where they wanted to go. After the stretch in the 80s where it was kind of touch and go, this one was the real last attempt at creating something new. It's soaking in that 80s disco that at this point in 1986 was already too old. There wasn't anything new on the scene, and the music scene as a whole was really interesting at this time. Like the underground hip hop and R&B was really starting to make their way through. Punk was just starting to fade away. Disco had long since gone. And I know ELO had flirted with disco quite a bit in the late 70s, early 80s to quite a bit of success. But at this point, it's just really hard to get through within Balance of Power. There's no innovation on this album. I'm glad that it's short. That is one of the saving graces on it. But it's not a complete saving grace, because the entire time I'm listening to Balance of Power, I'm like, nope, there's the orchestra is all but gone within it, and whenever they are, it feels like a gimmick rather than a really interesting influx of music. It's just not worth your time. I would suggest moving on to the next part.
Don't wanna talk, don't wanna walk, don't wanna do.
Number 15, ELO Part 2, Moment of Truth, released in 1994. So this album needs a little bit of a history lesson, because the band kind of split in the early 90s. So you had Jeff Lynne on the one side and most of the other band on the other side. And Jeff Lynne was like kind of ready to just call it quits and put a hiatus and brakes on. But the rest of the band was just like, no, we want to do something else. And that's when they put out ELO Part 2. Unlike the first album that they put out with Part 2, this one feels much more like its own identity. They found what worked for them. Unfortunately, what they found wasn't all that exciting. The orchestra feels a little bit more incorporated within the band at this point, but it also has that essence of it being more of a gimmick than anything else. And this album has a number of really bad tracks. Like, I'm talking like cringe-worthily bad. Don't Wanna and Whiskey Girls are like ZZ Top blues style that they're trying to infuse, but it doesn't work. It's really bad. It's really cringeworthy. These two tracks, every time they come on, I'm like, oh god, no, please. But that's not to say that the entire album is a complete waste of time. The overtures and the interludes on this album are pretty tasty. Overall, this album is still a little bit of a mess, and I can see why they called it quits after this. They didn't put out a third ELO Part 2 album. But yeah, this album is forgettable in the best case and rememberable for those really bad tracks. So let's move on to the next one.
I hear the
Number 14, their debut album, Electric Light Orchestra, or No Answer, released in 1971. Alright, so, as with a lot of these, you know, the first couple of albums, they're always trying to find their feet, and within this one, they found their feet pretty quickly, but that first album is still a little bit touch and go. There's still a little bit of a wandering of the landscape. Even though this album is pretty low on my list, it came out swinging and hard. I can feel the passion that the boys are bringing within this album, and when they're infusing more of that rock and roll from like the 60s within this kind of new approach, because again, at this time in 1971, that progressive rock movement was really taking the land by storm. So ELO infusing that rock and roll, like not just straight up rock music, but rock and roll with more of this classical approach and classical instrumentations, really great experiment. Unfortunately, much like most experiments, not everything's going to work. There wasn't a whole lot of like straight up rock music or rock and roll, nor were there too many of the pop music that we see in the mid 70s. I don't feel all that inspired when I'm listening to this album, and I don't really come back to this album very often. It also feels pretty dark, and I mean the first 3 albums from ELO are quite dark in tone, but this one's probably the darkest out of all of them. But it does show how the band started out and where they're going to grow and where they're going to find their feet. So yeah, I mean, this is probably the beginning of the least best of their work.
Hello, hello, your smiling face, your warm
Number 13, ELO Part 2, released in 1990. I would put this one above Part 2, Moment of Truth, only because there are a lot less bad songs on it. The album itself is almost a bait and switch as well, which is in some ways good, but in some ways not. Like, whereas I remember Moment of Truth for its bad songs, Part 2 I remember for its good songs, and that's really the first 2 tracks of Hello, Hello, and Honest Men. These 2 tracks that start off the album really feel like ELO. Like, they really feel like an Electric Light Orchestra. It almost feels like coming home in that sense. They're really channeling that mid-70s pop, really optimistic and fun. And yeah, it was like kind of a jolt of energy back into this band. But the album also has a bit of a, as I said, bait and switch. After the album starts off with those first 2 tracks, it does start to lose steam fast. I feel it's caught between trying to do something new and trying to emulate the spirit of the past. And although you can do this, you can still maintain that identity from the past while moving the music forward, I feel like these guys didn't know which way to go. So there are times when it feels like they're moving the music forward, but there are also times when it feels like they want to like hunker back to the 70s, and it felt like a really strange hodgepodge, especially for the 90s. Outside of Hello, Hello, and Honest Men, Love of a Woman is also a really good track on this album. And so, as I said, I remember this album for its good songs as opposed to the bad songs. So that's what really put it above it for me.
It's either real or it's a dream, there's nothing that is in between. Twilight.
Number 12, Twilight, released in 1981. Alright, so I know a lot of people love this album, and for good reasons. It has an amazing concept. I love the narrative of this album. I really like that futuristic neo-noir, and some of the music really shines through within that. You know, I love the opening track in Twilight. Those 2 tracks are just so fun. The energy that they have within this is a lot of, like, it's a great time. And that closing piece is also really, really good, but, honestly, I can't get into this album. I mean, it was one of the albums that I had since I was a kid. Outside of those first couple of tracks, I kind of lose interest in this album. A lot of the songs really don't do too much for me. I know that they're trying new things, and in 1981, the music landscape was really like trying new things. So it was a really strange blending, and in some ways this works, and for many people it works really, really well. But for me, outside of the fantastic narrative story and the concept of this album, there's not a whole lot here for me to dive into. It's still a great time, and, you know, I don't dread listening to it, but it's not one that I'll seek out and look to put on.
I spent some time.
Number 11, Zuma, released in 2001. So after the big hiatus of ELO and ELO Part 2, The band came back together in the early 2000s with Zuma, and I gotta admit, I really enjoy this album. This is a fantastic, fun album. It's poppy, the energy is there. They really went back to that 70s pop with the harmonizations, including the orchestra without being overly used as a gimmick, as a lot of the albums that I already talked about really do. And for a band to release something with such a long hiatus and this far into their career with such a strong album, it's a really great time, and I encourage those who are fans of ELO to go and check this album out. The biggest weakness about this album, though, is pretty obvious. It's a Beatles clone album. It is a straight up Beatles clone. They ripped off so many things from the Beatles. It's almost embarrassing. And I also don't feel like there's a whole lot of originality on this album as well. It does feel like generic ELO music on it. There are glimmers of passion about this album, and I could tell that the boys are really passionate about what they're doing on here because the energy and flow is on that. But afterwards, I had to sit down and listen to the White Album from the Beatles just to get some of the harmonies that they stole out of my head, because I'm like, the Beatles kind of did this better back in the 60s. Again, at this point in their career, they're not trying to push or break any new boundaries. They're just there to have fun, and that's what this album is. It's a fun album. So, yeah, let's move on to the next one. Number 10, Alone in the Universe, released in 2015. So, Jeff Lynne's ELO. This is kind of like the answer to ELO Part 2. Yeah, I really, really enjoy Alone in the Universe. It does follow suit a little bit with Zoom in that there's nothing really new found on the album. There's, no pushing of boundaries or anything like that, but it isn't a Beatles clone album. It's completely and 100% an ELO project, even though it's pretty much fronted by Jeff Lynne. But no, the tracks on here are still fantastic. They feel fresh, they feel new. Jeff Lynne kind of took a look at what worked throughout the entire discography of ELO and just concentrated on that. And I feel that is a huge benefit for this album. Even though some of the songs are a little bit more melodramatic at times, sometimes it's a little bit darker, especially with the title track or When I Was a Boy. These guys are definitely the standout tracks on here. I just love the harmonies. Yeah, I think that's all I got to say about Alone in the Universe. Let's move on to number 9. Number 9, Discography, released in 1979. Alright, so this album I know a lot of people really, really enjoy. For me, it's a little bit of a mixed grab bag. It's definitely one of those hit and miss. Like when the songs hit, they hit hard. And we're looking at Don't Bring Me Down and The Diary of Horace Wimp. These two tracks just make me melt. And those two tracks alone are what put it so high on the list. I would probably have no problem putting this below Zoom had it not been for Don't Bring Me Down and The Diary of Horace Wimp. They were less on the Beatles pop from the 60s, and they just dove into the 70s pop with the disco scene. And it's funny because one of the biggest tracks on this album, the Last Train to London, I'm sorry, I can't stand this song. I know a lot of people love Last Train to London. For me, a good disco track needs to have that passion. It needs to have that oomph. And I don't feel it with Last Train to London. It's just kind of there. But Discovery, still great work. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. Number 8, Xanadu, original soundtrack, released in 1980. Yeah, I said I was going to put everything on here. I love Xanadu. I love the movie. I love the soundtrack. I love that they incorporated Olivia Newton-John in here. How can you not love a movie that's a musical based around roller skates? I mean, it's way too much fun. I like this album that they tried something a little bit different. I mean, half the album is Olivia Newton-John's work, but the other half is straight up ELO, and the ELO stuff is just brilliant. Don't Walk Away, It's Alright, and the title track of Xanadu, so much fun. They've got the poppy, they've got a little bit of the rock and roll. There are a few moments on here that's almost like a big band rock and roll. And I love that this is like a side project that made it into their full discography. It's really fun. And the other thing is they never really take themselves completely serious. They're just there to have fun. And I think that's what really elevates it for me. The songs are catchy, they're memorable, they stick in my head, they have earworms. And yeah, did I mention it was fun? Because It's fun. The only drawback is that the Olivia Newton-John stuff isn't stellar. It does feel a little bit out of place, especially within the entire discography of ELO. And yeah, I think blending Olivia's like vocal work with ELO really did it well. Like on that title track of Xanadu, having her as the front person on that track was such a great idea. Her vocals bleed perfectly into the rest of the album, and it's a really, really great time within that. So yeah, love Xanadu, the original soundtrack. It's one that I put on as a slight guilty pleasure. I'm not all that guilty about listening to it, but it's a great time, and I have no problem listening to it. It's great. Number 7, Secret Message, released in 1983. I know a lot of people aren't a big fan of this album, but for me, I love it. And I think the thing that puts it above the albums that came out around the time, like we're looking at Xanadu, we're looking at Time, the passion and energy that's on this album is infectious. They are having so much fun with this album, and I would put this way above Discography in a heartbeat, as I've already done. Although the songs aren't necessarily the best, and there's no like one or two song that kind of floats above the rest. And I mean, in some ways, that's kind of the weakness, in that there's no real one memorable moment on here. Like I can't just pick out one song outside of maybe Rock and Roll is King. Like especially when they're going to that Lama Bama Rama Bama Rock and Roll is King. How can you not love that? I mean, it's a throwback to that rock and roll stuff. So yeah, I love Secret Message. I feel like it needs a little bit more respect. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. Number 6, Face the Music, released in 1975. This is probably when we, move into the classics, and I'm using like the classics with air quotes here because with Face the Music, that's when we're getting into like the heyday of ELO. They were moving away from their more experimental orchestration of music that we found within the early part of their career, and this is when they're starting to dip their toe into more of the poppy stuff. There were real bangers before this, but we're looking at Evil Woman, Night Rider, and Strange Magic. These are staple ELO songs. Evil Woman, probably one of the most recognizable ones outside of Mr. Blue Sky. There's no real low point on this album. There's no track that I just can't listen to. The band has really found their stride. They found out what kind of a band they want to be, and they went for it. They went full on pop without sacrificing originality, without sacrificing sophistication, and without sacrificing some of those darker instrumental moments as well, because there's quite a number of really dark moments on this album as well that I really, really enjoy. So that's probably why it's coming into the final stretch of the list. And I think now we're coming into the top 5 albums of theirs. So let's talk about number 5. Number 5, A New World Record, released in 1976. So this one might be one of the darkest albums that the band has ever released, and this is when they were like really, again, starting to find themselves within the music landscape, riding the coattails very heavily off of their 1975 release of Face the Music. A New World Record is I think a big improvement from there. Most of the tracks on here are very poppy in a sense, but the ones that I like are those that kind of experiment a little bit more. Mission is probably my favorite track out of all of ELO's work. They're blending more of that identity that they want to put forth as well as that experimentation. But because of this, there is still a little bit of wandering around and kind of finding their feet. They haven't really found and solidified that identity yet on this album. There are a few songs that don't quite work, but yeah, it's still a fantastic work. I love, as I said, Mission and Tightrope, great tracks. And yeah, so let's move on to the next one.
Mr. Blue Sky, please tell us why you had to hide away for so.
Number 4, Out of the Blue, released in 1977. So these guys were just banging them out, album after album after album. And in 1977, they released their double album. One side is a Rainy Day Suite, and I love that Rainy Day Suite. It ends with the iconic Mr. Blue Sky, probably their most recognizable and famous song. For a double album, it is solid from start to finish. There's no low point, there's never any reason to skip any of the songs, there's no filler as well, and there's just a lot of really fun tracks. It does remind me a little bit of, say, like a White Album from the Beatles, in that they're trying different styles. Fantastic. And this was the album that really, really blended that poppy approach with the orchestra. It's no wonder why it's a lot of people's favorite album from theirs, but if you haven't noticed, we still have 3 albums to talk about, so let's talk about them. Number 3, ELO 2, released in 1972. As you can tell, this was a huge improvement from their first album. This is their second album, and holy geez, did they improve leaps and bounds. There's only 5 tracks, the second side having 2 beautiful tracks, and it has their first real banger of Roll Over Beethoven. I mean, what can't be said about Roll Over Beethoven? It is rock and roll to a T. I love that they're incorporating longer compositions within their albums. I think this has the longest compositions. With each album, at this point, I'm trying to look at weaknesses. And there's not a whole lot that can be found in terms of weaknesses on this. Sometimes those experimentations within the longer tracks don't quite work. And there are a few times when I feel like they may have overdid it just slightly. It has so many of those big moments, and this is something that only ELO could do at the time because of the full orchestra backing them up. Creating those big sounds, those big movements, even though it is a very dark album at times. Okay, so we're down to the final 2, which means when I reveal which one is number 2, you obviously know which one is number 1 from process of elimination. So I was actually going back and forth as to which one was number 1. It was really hard. The last 2 albums that I hadn't talked about so far are so close at being my number 1 spot. It is like splitting hairs. At the end of the day, I can only really crown one as being their best. They're one that I would go to first. So let's talk about the second one. Number 2, On the Third Day, released in 1973. This, as I said, was really hard. I friggin' love this album. There are so many moments on here that really bang. Like, holy geez. The leaps that they went through between the first and second album were pretty much matched between the second and third album. I think, honestly, the reason why this album was pegged at being a little bit weaker is that last song of In the Hall of the Mountain King. It's so strange that a song like this that could only be done by Electric Light Orchestra is the weakest of the track, because I don't know if it quite worked as much as they wanted it to. Instead of having this rock and roll in a more fun approach as they did with Roll Over Beethoven, In the Hall of the Mountain King is much more of a classical song that's been infused a little bit with rock and roll, and I don't know if it quite worked to the same extent. But other than that, the entirety of the rest of the album is just stellar and friggin' amazing. I can't help but gush more than once on this album. There are so many great pieces that infuse that piano, that infuse the guitar, the harmonies on this album, all fantastic. And I just like, mwah, 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 so good. So, process of elimination, we already know what number 1 is, so let's talk about the number 1 spot.
I will be free.
Number 1, Eldorado, released in 1974. Yep, I couldn't say no. I couldn't allow this album to not be number 1. This album's one of my favorite albums of all time, and it's a travesty that it gets overlooked in terms of progressive rock. This was the first album of theirs, and I think that's what really put it over the edge for me, is that they started to move away from that rock and roll classical approach and started to infuse more of the poppy stuff. This is where we're getting those poppy ballads like Can't Get It Out of My Head, Nobody's Child, Boy Blue, and just that ending of Eldorado and Eldorado Final. I mean, they infused that orchestra within the Eldorado Overture and Eldorado Final. Those orchestrated movements are so fun. I can't help but friggin' love it. And that ending piece of Eldorado, I weep. Like, it is so moving. The vocals of this are just, there's so much passion. There's so much, like, raw emotion on it that I just can't help but love. And it's such a beautiful concept album. I can gush forever about this album, but I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'll probably do a full-length album review of this one day. Brilliant, brilliant album. One of my favorite concept albums, and that's stacked against a lot of really great concept albums. And really, that's about it. Those are all of Electric Light Orchestra's albums ranked, in my opinion, from their worst to their best. What did you guys think? What is your favorite ELO album? Which one's the one that you don't like the most? How am I wrong? Let me know about all that by commenting down below. I believe it is Franklin's birthday. So Franklin, happy birthday. I hear you're a really big fan of mine. Thank you so much for watching. It means so much to me. So yeah, I'm just wishing you a happy birthday on this, hopefully posting it on February 14th. Thank you guys all for watching. This has always been a treat of mine, and I love diving into one specific group. Even though this group might not have been the first choice for many people, it's a band that I love. And yeah, I think that's about it. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.